maybe I should have been more specific. I want to bring in the spectre of history. History, citizenship and nationality, how it impinges on us and how our idea of citizenship relates to history or does not relate to history. And so, before I come to citizenship or the idea itself, what it means to be Indian, I will just take two instances just to explain why I'm setting up this context. And it has a little to do with my own journalistic career, my own background. I have been based outside Delhi for quite a while as a journalist. I spent 6 or 7 years in Punjab. I'm myself a Sikh in the sense, to the extent it means anything to be Sikh while you are an atheist, but normally we are all culturally rooted in wherever we originate from, irrespective of whether we choose to call ourselves that or not. The other is Madhya Pradesh. I grew up in Madhya Pradesh. I again went back and reported for the Indian Express in Madhya Pradesh. I was based for 2 or 3 years there. So I have spent 8, 10, 12 years actually reporting outside Delhi, living outside Delhi. As an adult, I don't mean while growing up. And to me, both these states, in their different ways, different sections, gave me an insight into a certain kind of history that we often tend to ignore. And so when I mean history, I do believe that in Delhi we run into two huge streams of history. One is, of course, the right-wing version of history. It has certain stresses, it has certain emphasis. There is also a nationalist project of history, which also has its own ideas, own presumptions, own beliefs. One of the people that I've reported closely on, and I've written a book by traveling along the Narmada, are the Gonds. And often today when we talk of Bastar, we talk of tribal areas, we talk of tribal sentiments, we often forget that there is a very vibrant tribal history. And the Gonds in particular are a people with a history as deep in the subcontinent as any other people. And that history is not just a history of the way we look at tribal India. It is a history of classical kingdoms, it is a history of empire, it is a history of war, it is a history of conquest. And that history roughly of kingdom and conquest ends. And I'll just read out a little bit to just tell you what that history of the Gonds was. And that is something I see reflected when I travel in that area. That is, by the mid-16th century, we are talking of 1550, 1560, the Gond kingdom was actually larger than several countries in the world today, several European countries. And it lay in Madhya Pradesh. To its west lay the Malwa kingdom, which then was ruled by the Afghan Baz Bahadur, a name which is more common in history than the Gond kingdom itself is. And somewhere between 1550 and 1560, Baz Bahadur actually fought the Gond queen Durgavati in battle. Durgavati defeated the Malwa sultans, but it weakened the Gond kingdom to an extent that a few years later, when Asaf Khan, who's Akbar's general, finally attacked Durgavati, Durgavati was slain in battle, and Chauragarh, the great fortress of the Gonds, almost impregnable. I have been to that place. It is situated today, very difficult to get, high up, dense forests, up a mountain, the walls seem impregnable. The last of the Gonds fighting Akbar's general Asaf Khan died. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because for the Gonds who are now coming to modernity today, who are seeking their own history in the subcontinent, Akbar is a figure who's very different from the Akbar that we think of. Akbar is a figure who is the end of a possibility, the extinguishing of a certain history, the realization that we could have been something else if this history had not ended in a certain way. There's another example from Punjab, and this is an example that I often run into because in our version, 1857 is a very contentious period of Indian history. It is read and written about in a certain way. But for me, even despite being religious, the crucial period in Indian history at that time is not 1857 but 1845. And what happens in 1845? In 1845, the Sikh Empire fights the British. The first Sikh war takes place. But again, the terms I'm using, Sikh war, British Empire, take away the complexity of that history, because it was not primarily a Sikh empire. It was most definitely a place where a regional sentiment of being Punjabi had become very, very strong. And I say that because the history of the first Sikh war among the Punjabis themselves is celebrated by the writing of a poet of Punjab called Shah Muhammad. And Shah Muhammad has written about the Sikh war, and Shah Muhammad has written after the end of the Sikh war, so he's not catering to his patrons who were Sikh emperors. And he writes, and I'll just read out just one little paragraph in Punjabi, and I say why that is important, is that Hukum laat kita lashkar aapne nu, tusan laaj अंग्रेज दी रखनी जी, सिंगा मार के कटक मुकाई दिते, Hindustani te Purbi Dakhni ji, which roughly translates to, that regrouping the troops, the Tunda Lord, the Lord said, the honor of England is in your hands. The Singhs have destroyed everything before them. They have not even spared the Hindustani units, the Purbiya units, or the Dakhnis. For Shah Muhammad in 1845, the idea of being Punjabi was an idea that was different from being a Purbiya or a Hindustani or a Dakhni. There was a clear Punjabi identity in his mind. So what I'm saying is, when we come to 1947, I believe that we come to a unique moment in the subcontinent. It is a moment not rooted in history. It is people with different understandings of history, with contradictory versions of who they are, agreeing on something. And that is the idea of citizenship of India. If you open the Indian Constitution, and I had come to lecture here at the NLU some months back, and the students had given me this very handy copy of the Constitution of India. If you can pick it up, I think everybody should have it. It's good to flip through and look at. And if you open the Indian Constitution, it begins by saying, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and to secure all its citizens. But I want to stop here. The people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India. But what is India? We are beginning at the very beginning. We are trying to define India. And the definition for India that we have is the most bureaucratic definition that you can imagine. The Constitution just says, name and territory of the Union. India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. What are these states? These are listed under Schedule A of the Constitution, and then we have a list. Andhra Pradesh, this. The most important thing about this definition is that history is not invoked once in the Republic of India when we are defining citizenship. There is no recourse to history when we are talking about citizenship. There is no recourse even to a geographical past when we are discussing citizenship. The citizenship that we are discussing is a citizenship born out of a set of shared ideas enshrined in the Constitution. We are a republic of the mind. We are not a republic defined by geography or history. The geography and history are ancillary, set down in a bureaucratic list at the end of the Constitution. We primarily come together as a republic through ideas that we share and we agree to share. This is what is common to the Punjabi, the Gond, the Kannada, whoever it is that constitutes a citizen of this country. And that idea is what is important. And why do I say that this idea is what we have to look at? Because there can be nothing more contradictory to the idea than the idea the men who rule today in India actually espouse. And I'll just read out the idea that comes from the most influential, and I must say, however much I may dislike the man, I think one of the most central figures of the 20th century in terms of ideas, unfortunately, is a man named Golwalkar. Not Savarkar, not any other figure in the Sangh, but it is Golwalkar to whom Modi owes a direct debt. It is to Golwalkar that the RSS often turns to. And what does Golwalkar say? I'll just read out. All such works which help nourishing and strengthening this national ethos are national. All such groups who consider themselves distinct from this national ethos and cherish hopes and aspirations in opposition to the national ones and demand separate rights and privilege for themselves are to be called communal. The Hindus in Bharat could never be communal, he wrote, because the nation's life values were derived from the life of Hindus. The expression communalism of the majority is totally wrong and misconceived. In a democracy, the opinion of the majority has to hold sway in the day-to-day life of the people. As such, it will be but proper to consider the practical conduct of the life of majority as the actual life of the national entity. You cannot get two ideas more disparate than that. But what we have to remember is that one of these ideas is illegitimate because we have actually come together on a certain claim, a certain idea that is exactly the antithesis. A complete contradiction, a complete denouncement of what today is every day espoused by every important leader of the ruling party. And I tell you with firm conviction that these people have not read the very constitution that defines their powers, that establishes them in power, that actually makes them what they are. For them to speak this language is actually to speak in defiance of what we have agreed on, to speak in defiance of what allows a Gond, a Sikh, a Kannada to be actually part of this union. Otherwise, we would have no union, we would have no republic, we would have no constitution, we would have no idea of citizenship if this actually was what had been tried and formulated by the founding fathers of the republic. And it is in this context that I must turn to the fact that we are a republic and the citizenship is of a republic. What is a republic? A republic, as I said, is a great set of ideas, but what are these ideas? When we look at the idea of a republic, it is the idea of a representative government with checks and balances defined by a constitution. This is the problem I have, I think, in this recent, when this, much before AAP became a party, I think when they were talking of direct democracy, of people voting for every issue, I think they did not understand what they were arguing against. They were arguing against the very idea of representative democracy, of mediated democracy. The problems with direct democracy, where people are actually voting, deciding on every important issue directly as citizens, is an idea that goes back to the Greeks and has been negated several times because of the dangers, the passions, the immediate passions that can overturn sensible public opinion into the opinion of a mob. That is why democracy failed in Greece. That is why democracy became so limited in Rome. That is why the idea of representative democracy first came about. That is why, if you look at when the American Constitution is framed, that is why these ideas of checks and balances, of representatives elected who mediate on decisions first came about. It is as if the leaders of the AAP, and I'm not talking of the leaders today, I'm even talking of people like Prashant, who have read constitutional law, had forgotten that there is an entire reason that we have evolved from the direct democracy to a representative democracy. And they've forgotten the dangers that ideas were posing to them. So when the Americans first started debating the idea of a constitutional republic, their first fear was exactly the fear that Golwalkar condemns right in the beginning. The expression communalism of the majority is totally wrong and misconceived, says Golwalkar. If we go back to the discussions of the American founders of the American Constitution, when they are arguing for a constitution and the need for a constitution, right in the very beginning, this is an essay by James Madison, I think one of the most important figures in constitutional history, where he's saying the utility of the union. By union, he means again a republic constituted by a constitution, is as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. What is a domestic faction? A faction is a group of citizens united by a common impulse of passion or of interest to the detriment of every other citizen in the country. The great danger in a democracy is that a set of people so convinced in their beliefs may want to act in a fashion that is a detriment to the interest of every other citizen. And the most dangerous kind of faction is when a majority is included in faction. The form of popular government enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the right of other citizens. The most dangerous kind of issue that we deal with in any democracy, that the reason we have a constitution and a representative republic is exactly to guard against the ideas Golwalkar is advocating. And if you look at the Indian constitution, while the idea of citizenship is not based on history, and in fact is in contradistinction to history, it opposes the idea of history as a basis for citizenship. It also tries to safeguard us from the dangers of history, which is that it recognizes that when we form a union, there is a certain history that we must safeguard against. And what is the kind of history that it safeguards against? There is a Dalit history to this country. That Dalit history has placed Dalits in a particular situation in 1947. The Constitution seeks to safeguard against that. There is a particular history of the tribes in this country. And while the Constitution again has done a lot, unfortunately, I think the greatest failure of independent India, starting from 47 onwards, is the unlived promise of what the Constitution has stated for the tribals. It has never been acted out on. There are special powers granted to the government, to the governor, to the administration to look after the rights of the tribals. These have never been exercised. So if there is one great failure of Indian democracy, it is that the idea of citizenship that took in view the specific historical conditions of the tribals has never been lived out. It has never been actually accomplished in real principles. And finally, I think that the Indian Constitution, and I think it's almost unique in this, that when it lists in the preamble certain rights, it talks about justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. These are rights that are available to every citizen, but it also includes certain rights which can only be called group rights. And while we talk of, in a number of cases, of individual rights, how courts, how institutions must guard individual rights, we must factor in the fact that this Constitution specifically understands that there is an idea of groups that is important in India, and that idea of groups needs to be safeguarded. And as I said, there are Dalit rights, there are tribal rights, but there is also, given the fact that the tyranny of a majority is a real problem in any democracy, that there are certain rights which I think the Indian Constitution grants to citizens that exist almost in no other democracy that I know of. And that is something I've written about early, but I want to again stress, and to me one of the most important and fundamentally least evoked section of the Constitution is what I call Article 29, Article 29.1. And what does Article 29.1 say? Let me just find it and read it out to you. It's titled Protection of the Interests of Minorities. And Article 29.1 says, any section of the citizens residing in the territory of India or any part thereof having a distinct language, script or culture of its own shall have the right to conserve the same. And if you read this carefully, it doesn't even use the word minority at all. It says any section of citizens residing in the territory of India having a distinct language, script or culture shall have the right to conserve the same. It also restricts the right of states and state legislatures to pass legislation, for example, a ban on beef. If I am a Goan Christian who has by tradition been eating beef and I have settled in numbers in the state of Maharashtra, the state actually cannot impose ideas and values that are contradictory to the cultural ethos of how I live my life. That extends across the board. I mean, all I'm saying is that in our acceptance largely of what we see is local tyrannies, local majorities, we have forgotten that our protection for minorities runs so deep that it is neither the center nor the state legislature which should actually be allowed to override these protections. I wish I have tried to ask a few constitutional lawyers that why has this section never been challenged constitutionally or actually put to the test by anyone. But I know of no examples where Article 29(1) has been invoked itself. But clearly for Ambedkar and for Nehru, it was clear that these articles were fundamental to our constitution and to the rights of citizenship. And they saw these rights of citizenships not as concessions, but tied very clearly to the notion of what kind of country it is. And I just want to end by something that I found, reading through the debates on citizenship, where there were a lot of technical sort of debates on who comes into India after 1948, at which point do you get citizenship of India, at which point you do not get citizenship of India. Nehru, while answering these questions, talking of these issues, Nehru intercedes and takes up two issues which we think are part of our modern terminology. But Nehru saw the need in 1949 to address these issues and counter it. And I'll read out what Nehru says, these two things. One word has been thrown about a lot. I should like to register my strong protest against that word. I want the House to examine the word carefully, and it is that this government goes in for a policy of appeasement of Pakistan, appeasement of Muslim, appeasement of this and that. This is Nehru speaking in 1949, not the India of 1980, 1990, not the BJP's rhetoric. So this idea has been with us right from the foundation, that there has been this idea that this country is full of appeasement. Basically, we are born out of appeasement. And Nehru says, I want to know clearly what that word means. Do the honorable members who talk of appeasement think that some kind of rule should be applied when dealing with these people which has nothing to do with justice or equality? I want a clear answer to that. If so, I would only plead for appeasement. This government will not go by a hair's breadth to the right or to left from what they consider to be the right way of dealing with the situation, justice to the individual or the group. Again clear that when we agreed to the constitution, justice to the group, justice to the minority, justice to what constitute the various factions of this republic is key to our idea of citizenship. And the idea of appeasement that is being used now was being used right from the beginning and had been already challenged, questioned and answered right at the inception of the republic. The second thing, and again because these words come together, appeasement, the second thing, another word is thrown up a good deal, the secular state business. May I beg with all humility, those gentlemen who use this word often to consult some dictionary before they use it. It is brought in at every conceivable step and at every conceivable stage. I just do not understand it. It has a great deal of importance, no doubt, but it is brought in all context, as if by saying that we are a secular state, we have done something amazingly generous, given something out of our pocket to the rest of the world, something which we ought not to have done, so on and so forth. We have only done something which every country does, except for a few misguided and backward countries in the world. Let us not refer to that word in the sense that we had done something very mighty. Again, right at the beginning, Nehru says, forget appeasement and accept secularism, because these are the very basics of the idea of citizenship and justice that any country should give to any of its citizens. Okay. Roughly, that to me the extent. There are other issues dealing with all these issues, but to me, the point I wanted to stress today was that the idea of Indian citizenship is not rooted in history, it is not rooted in our geography, it is rooted in a share of constituted values that we have all agreed on, and inherent in the idea of those values is the need to safeguard against history. Which is why I often say, and I've always said, that we should not even worry about contesting the right when they present a certain version of history. The only answer to the right is you can construct any history you want. It really does not matter. That is worth nothing in terms of how I relate to this country. You cannot challenge the ideas that lie at the very basis of my citizenship. And that citizenship is not stronger or weaker because of a history that a certain person may have in this country. And that is something those people do not understand. If you look at our idea of citizenship in this republic in 1947, we were unique that that idea of citizenship also applied to the colonizers. If any Englishman had chosen at that stage to stay back as a citizen of India, on the grounds they were resident of India for 5 years, they could all have been citizens, as long as they shared the ideas that made this republic. It was not about being English, about Hindu or Muslim. It was about a set of shared ideas. That is what constitutes India. That is what constitutes citizenship. That is roughly where I want to end it with.